History is long. Like, really long. So we're going to do something ambitious. We're going to take one of the world's oldest civilizations, Iran, and cover it 1 century at a time. 10 minutes per episode. Every episode, 100 years. No filler, no fluff, just the moments that actually shaped a nation. Episode 1. The year is 1500, and Iran, as a unified country, basically doesn't exist yet. It's a patchwork of kingdoms, tribes, and foreign rulers. Squeezed between empires, forgotten by the world. But not for long. Meet Ismail, son of a murdered father, imprisoned as a child, hunted by enemies who knew that if this kid grew up, he'd be trouble. They were right. Ismail I belonged to the Safavid family, a mystical Sufi order from northwestern Iran. His family had been building followers for generations. Not an army yet. More like a devoted fan base. Except instead of concert tickets, they were offering spiritual salvation. And instead of fans, they were warriors. These were the Qizilbash, Turkic tribesmen who believed, sincerely and completely, that Ismail wasn't just their leader. He was divine, a living saint, the shadow of God on earth. Now imagine fighting for someone you believe is literally blessed by God. You don't retreat, you don't negotiate, you charge. Between 1500 and 1510, this teenage king and his red-hatted warriors swept across the Iranian plateau like a wildfire, defeating the Ak-Koyunlu Confederation, taking Tabriz, unifying territory from eastern Anatolia to Khorasan. In less than a decade, Iran had gone from patchwork of chaos to unified empire, and Ismail was 14 when it started. Now here's where Ismail does something that will echo for 500 years. He makes a declaration. Iran is now officially a Shia Muslim state. Everyone converts. No debate, no referendum. Just, this is who we are now. Was this purely religious? Almost certainly not. Think about it politically. Iran is surrounded by Sunni powers. The Ottomans on the left, the Uzbeks on the right. By making Shi'ism the state religion, Ismail isn't just defining a faith. He's drawing a border, a cultural moat, an identity so distinct that his population wouldn't melt into the Ottoman Empire or defect to the Uzbeks. To be Iranian now meant something specific. It was, by any measure, one of the most strategically brilliant and historically consequential decisions in the history of the Middle East. The Sunni-Shia divide you read about in the news today, a big part of it hardens right here, in 1501, by a teenager. Everything was going well for Ismail until he met someone who didn't care about divine blessing. Ottoman Sultan Selim I, nicknamed Selim the Grim, was marching east with a very modern army and a very simple philosophy. Cannons win wars. Ismail was warned. His own advisors begged him, don't fight them in an open field. The Ottomans have artillery. They have firearms. Our cavalry can't charge through cannon fire. But Ismail, who had never lost a battle, believed his men's faith was stronger than Ottoman steel. It wasn't a battle. It was a lesson. The Qizilbash charged with everything they had, and the Ottoman cannons simply erased them, row after row. The bravery was real. The faith was real. But gunpowder doesn't negotiate with faith. Ismail lost. Badly. Chalderan didn't destroy the Safavid Empire, but it humbled it, and it revealed something brutal. Iran had a technology gap. While the Ottomans and the Europeans were racing into the age of gunpowder, Iran was still perfecting the art of the cavalry charge. That gap would take generations to close. When Ismail died in 1524, his 10-year-old son Tahmasp inherited an empire that was exhausted, humiliated, and under pressure from two directions simultaneously. The Ottomans were pushing from the west, the Uzbeks were raiding from the east, and the Qizilbash chiefs, the very people who had built the empire, were now fighting each other for influence over the child king. Most rulers in this situation collapse. Tahmasp didn't. He was patient in a way that Ismail never was. He watched. He learned. He played the factions against each other until he actually had real power. It took him years, but he got there. Then the Ottomans came again, and again. Suleiman the Magnificent, arguably the most powerful ruler on the planet at the time, launched 4 major invasions of Iran during Tahmasp's reign. 4. And here's the remarkable thing. Tahmasp never fought him directly. Tahmasp's genius was the scorched earth strategy. When the Ottomans advanced, the Iranians didn't engage. They retreated. But before they left, they burned their own crops, emptied their own cities, destroyed their own supply depots. The Ottomans would march triumphantly into nothing. No food, no shelter, no enemy to fight, just empty land and a coming winter. It was maddening for the Ottomans. You can't defeat an enemy that won't stand and fight. You can't hold territory you can't supply. Suleiman took cities, including Tabriz, the Safavid capital, but he couldn't keep them. The cost of holding empty, hostile territory was too high. Every time, the Ottomans eventually withdrew. Every time, the Safavids moved back in. It wasn't glorious. There were no epic cavalry charges, no legendary duels, no inspiring last stands. It was grinding, painful, strategic endurance. Tahmasp's Iran survived not by being stronger, but by being smarter, by refusing to give its enemies the war they wanted. By the year 1600, something remarkable had happened. Iran, which barely existed as a unified state a century earlier, had not just survived. It had defined itself. A distinct religion, a distinct language, a distinct cultural identity that was neither Ottoman nor Central Asian. The Safavids had essentially built the concept of Iran as a state. The borders weren't perfect. The army wasn't the strongest. The economy had scars. But the idea of Iran as a place with a specific identity, a specific faith, a specific way of seeing itself, that idea was now real. And it was durable. 500 years later, it's still there. So what did the 1500s give Iran? An origin story, a founding myth, a set of borders, physical and cultural, that would shape everything that came after, and a lesson written in cannon smoke at Chalderan that being brave is not the same as being prepared. Iran survived the 1500s. Barely. But survival isn't the same as thriving. This episode, everything changes. We're entering the Golden Age, and it all begins with one man who looked at a broken empire and decided to rebuild every single piece of it. Let's set the scene. The year is 1587. Shah Abbas is 16 years old and has just been handed the Safavid throne. Sounds exciting. It wasn't. The empire was being eaten alive from every direction. The Ottomans had swallowed huge chunks of western Iran. The Uzbeks were raiding the east non-stop. And inside the empire, the Kizilbash chiefs were basically running everything, using the Shah as a puppet. Now here's what separates a great leader from an average one. An average leader sees this situation and panics. Abbas saw it and started taking notes. He understood something his predecessors didn't fully act on. The Kizilbash were not just his army. They were his cage. As long as he needed them, they controlled him. To be truly powerful, he needed soldiers who were loyal to him. Not to their tribe, not to their chief, to the Shah. But first, before he could reform anything, he needed to buy time. So Abbas did something that looked like weakness, but was actually chess. He signed a humiliating peace deal with the Ottomans, giving up massive territory just to free his hands to deal with the Uzbeks first. Now, let's talk about the most important thing Abbas did, and the thing most history books skim over. He completely rebuilt the Iranian military from scratch. He created 3 new forces. First, a personal cavalry called the Ghulam, made up of Georgian, Armenian and Circassian converts who owed everything to Abbas personally and had zero tribal loyalties. Second, a musketeer corps, because Abbas had not forgotten Chaldean. He had studied it. He understood that the future of war was gunpowder, and Iran needed to catch up fast. And this is where the story gets genuinely strange, because the people who helped Abbas modernize his army were two English brothers who had absolutely no business being in 16th century Persia. The Shirley brothers arrived in Isfahan in 1598, supposedly as diplomats. Robert Shirley ended up staying for years, helping Abbas reorganize his artillery and train his musketeers along European lines. It was one of the most unlikely military consulting gigs in history. The results were immediate. Abbas took his new army east, smashed the Uzbeks, reclaimed Khorasan. Then he turned west and took back everything he'd given the Ottomans in that peace deal. With interest. Military power secured, borders reclaimed. Now, Abbas turned to something that would make Iran not just powerful, but legendary. In 1598, Abbas moved his capital from Qazvin to Isfahan, and then he proceeded to build one of the most beautiful cities in human history. At the heart of it all, the Nakhchivan Square. Let's put this in perspective. When it was completed, it was one of the largest public squares on the planet. Bigger than the Piazza San Marco in Venice. Bigger than Tiananmen Square is today. It wasn't just a square. It was a statement. Abbas played polo here. He held public executions here. He welcomed foreign ambassadors here. Merchants sold silk here. Poets recited here. It was a throne room, a marketplace, a stadium, and a diplomatic hall, all in one open space. And speaking of silk, let's talk about money, because Abbas wasn't just building pretty architecture. He was engineering an economic revolution. Abbas established the royal silk monopoly. All silk production in Iran was controlled by the state. He invited Armenian merchants from Julfa, relocated them to a suburb of Isfahan called New Julfa, and gave them extraordinary privileges to trade on Iran's behalf across Europe and Asia. The result? By the mid-1600s, there was a Persian saying, "Isfahan is half the world." Not half of Iran, half of the world. That's the level of confidence we're dealing with. Now, here's something that doesn't get taught enough. Shah Abbas was one of the first rulers in the Islamic world to aggressively pursue alliances with Christian Europe. Not for religious reasons, for purely strategic ones. The logic was elegant. The Ottomans were fighting wars on two fronts, against Europe in the west and against Iran in the east. Abbas wanted to make sure those two fronts stayed active simultaneously. Every time Europe fought the Ottomans, Iran could breathe, and vice versa. Abbas sent ambassadors to Spain, to the papacy, to the Holy Roman Emperor, to England. He wrote letters to Elizabeth I of England. He received European artists, hosted Jesuit priests, and allowed Christian churches to be built in Isfahan. Not out of conversion interest, but because he understood that religious tolerance was good diplomacy. Robert Shirley, our confused English friend from earlier, was eventually sent back to Europe as Abbas's personal ambassador, an Englishman representing the Persian Shah in European courts. History is wonderfully strange. Shah Abbas the Great died in 1629, and here is where we have to be honest about something uncomfortable. Abbas himself planted the seeds of the empire's decline. Terrified of being overthrown by his own sons, the way he had seen happen in his own family, Abbas kept his princes locked in the harem, away from government, away from the military, away from the real world. He had his own son blinded. He had two others executed. He was protecting his throne. He was also raising heirs who had no idea how to rule. When Abbas died, his grandson Shah Safi took the throne. Safi was suspicious, cruel, and had grown up seeing his family members executed for ambition. His solution was to simply execute anyone who looked competent, which, as leadership strategies go, has some obvious flaws. His successor, Shah Abbas II, was actually decent, a brief flicker of the old greatness. But after him came Shah Suleiman, who spent most of his reign in the harem, delegating everything to court eunuchs and refusing to engage with the outside world. And then came Shah Sultan Hussein, the last Safavid Shah of the Golden Age, a pious, gentle man who was totally, completely, catastrophically unsuited for the chaos that was coming. By 1700, the Safavid Empire was still technically standing, but it was a magnificent hollow shell. The army was weak, the treasury was strained, the provinces were restless, and in the mountains of Afghanistan, a storm was gathering that would bring the whole Golden Age crashing down. So what did the 1600s give us? It gave us proof that one exceptional leader can lift an entire civilization. Abbas took a broken, humiliated empire and turned it into a global brand. The art, the architecture, the trade networks, the diplomacy, all of it was built in roughly 4 decades by one extraordinary mind. But the 1600s also gave us a warning. Greatness isn't automatically inherited. The institutions Abbas built were strong, but not strong enough to survive rulers who had never once left the palace. Next episode, the 1700s. The storm hits. Afghan invaders pour through the eastern gates. Isfahan. Half the world falls. The Safavid dynasty collapses after over 2 centuries. And from the chaos, from the complete collapse of everything Abbas built, one of the most extraordinary military minds in history will emerge. A man who will conquer from Delhi to Istanbul. A man so dominant on the battlefield that historians will call him diplomatic network stretching to Elizabeth I's court. And then his successors locked themselves in the palace, fired every competent person they knew, and waited for disaster. They didn't have to wait long. Welcome to the 1700s, the most violent, chaotic, dramatic century in Iranian history. Empires will fall. Conquerors will rise. A commoner will steal a throne, invade India, and bring home the most famous diamond in the world. And then lose his mind entirely. As the 1700s dawned, the once mighty Safavid Empire was a hollow shell of its former self. And sitting on the throne was Shah Sultan Hussein, quite possibly the least equipped ruler for the moment history had ever produced. Sultan Hussein was not evil. He was not cruel. He was deeply, sincerely pious, and completely detached from the reality of governing an empire under pressure from every direction. In the east, the Hotaki Afghans, a Pashtun tribal confederation that the Safavids had been mismanaging for decades, had finally had enough. Under their leader, Mahmud Hotaki, they organized, they marched, and in 1722, they arrived at the gates of Isfahan. What followed was a siege that lasted 7 agonizing months. No dramatic last stand, no heroic defense, just starvation, disease, and a court so paralyzed by indecision that they couldn't organize a coherent resistance. In October 1722, Shah Sultan Hussein walked out of the gates of Isfahan, removed his own turban, and placed it on Mahmud Hotaki's head. He surrendered his crown personally to a tribal rebel. 221 years of Safavid rule over. The Afghan occupation was brutal. Massacres, looting, the systematic destruction of the administrative networks Abbas had spent decades building. The city that was half the world was now an occupied ruin. Here is where it gets worse. Because the moment the Safavid Empire visibly collapsed, everyone who had been circling patiently decided it was time to land. The Ottomans immediately seized western Iran and the Caucasus. Peter the Great of Russia, who had been watching the Safavid collapse with barely concealed excitement, launched his Caspian campaign and grabbed the northern provinces. The Afghans held the center, and what was left of legitimate Iranian authority fragmented into competing warlords. For roughly 7 years, Iran as a unified state simply did not exist. It was a geographic expression, a memory, a name on a map that no longer corresponded to any single political reality. And now, finally, we meet the man this century was waiting for, Nader. Born around 1688 in the Khorasan region to a humble family. His father made felt. He was, by any conventional measure, nobody. He was enslaved as a young man after a tribal raid. He escaped. He joined various military factions, rose through pure competence and terrifying force of will, and by his 30s had become the most effective military commander in a country that desperately needed one. Nader aligned himself with a surviving Safavid prince, Shah II, not out of loyalty, but out of strategy. He needed a legitimate flag to march under while he did the real work of reconquering Iran. Between 1729 and 1735, Nader achieved what should have been impossible. He expelled the Afghans from central Iran. He pushed the Ottomans back out of the western territories. He negotiated the Russians out of the northern provinces. He reunified the country in 6 years. In 1736, Nader had had enough of pretending. He called a grand assembly, declared the Safavid line finished, and crowned himself Shah of Iran. The felt-maker's son was now the king of kings. Now, here is where Nader Shah goes from impressive to genuinely jaw-dropping, because after reunifying Iran, he decided, for reasons that were partly strategic and partly because he was Nader Shah, to invade the Mughal Empire. His official justification was that the Mughals were harboring Afghan rebels. His actual motivation was simpler. The Mughal Empire was fabulously, almost incomprehensibly wealthy, and Nader needed to fund his military machine. In 1739, Nader's army crossed into India. The decisive engagement came at the Battle of Colonial, and it was over almost before it began. Nader's artillery destroyed the Mughal formations before they could effectively engage. His cavalry flanked, his infantry advanced. The Mughal Emperor Muhammad Shah was captured personally. 3 hours. That was all it took. Nader entered Delhi, and then came the Delhi Massacre, a tragic, catastrophic event where a misunderstanding spiraled into Nader ordering his troops into the city, resulting in the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians. It remains one of the darkest moments of his campaign. From the ruins of his victory, Nader took what he came for, the contents of the Mughal treasury, so vast it allegedly allowed him to suspend taxation in Iran for 3 years, the Peacock Throne itself, which he brought back to Iran, and a small stone that would become the most famous jewel in history. Nader Shah returned from India at the absolute peak of his power. He controlled an empire stretching from the Caucasus to the Indus. He was unchallenged, undefeated, and he was beginning to unravel. The campaigns never stopped. The taxation to fund them became crushing. Revolts broke out across the empire, and Nader, who had always been ruthless, became paranoid, viciously, dangerously paranoid. When a revolt broke out in Khorasan and he suspected his own son Reza Kohli of being involved, a suspicion that was almost certainly false, Nader had him blinded. His own son, his intended heir. By the accounts of people who knew him, Nader was never the same after that moment. The guilt consumed him. The paranoia deepened. The violence against his own subjects escalated. The brilliant general was disappearing, replaced by something frightening. In 1747, his own officers, afraid for their lives, assassinated him in his tent while he slept. The Napoleon of Persia died not in battle, but at the hands of the men he commanded. After Nader's assassination, Iran collapsed into civil war again. A dozen warlords fought over the pieces of his empire. And from this chaos, one figure emerged who was genuinely, fascinatingly different from every ruler we've discussed so far. Karim Khan was a Lur tribesman from western Iran. He was tough, capable, and militarily gifted. He had to be to survive the post-Nader chaos. But what made him extraordinary was what he refused to do. Karim Khan refused the title of Shah entirely. He called himself Vakil ol-Roaya, the advocate of the people. In a century drowning in megalomaniacs and conquerors, he chose to present himself as a servant of his subjects. It wasn't just a title, it was a governing philosophy. He moved his capital to Shiraz, the city of poets and gardens, and what followed was one of the most peaceful, culturally rich periods in 18th century Iranian history. Art flourished, trade recovered, taxes were reasonable, justice was, remarkably, actually administered. He reportedly said that he had no desire for conquest, only for the welfare of his people. Whether or not he said it exactly that way, his actions matched the sentiment. He was in a century of extraordinary violence, an extraordinary anomaly. He died in 1779, peacefully, which was genuinely remarkable for an 18th century Iranian ruler. And the moment he died, the Zand dynasty began to collapse almost immediately, torn apart by succession wars. From the Zand succession wars, one faction emerged victorious, a Turkic tribal confederation from northern Iran called the Qajars, led by the ferocious Aga Muhammad Khan, who would bring the century to a close and open a new, complicated chapter in Iranian history. So what did the 1700s give Iran? Honestly, mostly scars. The fall of Isfahan, the Afghan occupation, Russian and Ottoman land grabs, the brilliant madness of Nader Shah, more civil wars than any century deserves. But the century also showed something important about Iran, the same thing the 1500s showed, that even in total collapse, the identity holds. The language, the culture, the sense of being distinctly, irreducibly Iranian. It survives everything, even itself. Next episode, the 1800s. The Qajars are in charge, and they are about to face something neither Nader's sword nor Karim Khan's wisdom could have prepared Iran for. Two of the most powerful empires in history, the British Empire and the Russian Empire, are about to turn Iran into their personal chessboard. This is the great game, and Iran didn't get to choose whether to play. Borders will be lost permanently. A revolution will be sparked in a tea house. And for the first time, the word constitution will be spoken in Persian. The 1800s opened with Iran technically unified under the Qajars, but deeply weakened. The treasury is thin. The army is outdated. The infrastructure that Abbas built 2 centuries ago is a memory. And into this moment of vulnerability walked 2 of the most powerful empires the modern world had ever produced. From the north, the Russian Empire. From the south, the British Empire. Iran didn't invite them, but Iran didn't have the power to stop them. Welcome to the great game. Let's meet the Qajars properly. Aga Muhammad Khan, the founder, was one of the most ruthless figures in Iranian history. He unified the country through absolute terror, established Tehran as the new capital, and was assassinated by his own servants in 1797, before he could even consolidate everything he'd built. His nephew Fath Ali Shah took over, and here is where the Qajar story gets complicated. Fath Ali Shah was not a bad man. He was cultured. He patronized the arts. He had an extraordinary beard that court painters clearly enjoyed drawing. But Fath Ali Shah came to power at the exact moment that 2 modernizing empires with professional armies, industrial weapons, and centuries of colonial experience decided that Central Asia was their next project. His court, for all its cultural sophistication, was not equipped for what was coming. The collision came fast. Russia had been expanding southward for decades, absorbing the Caucasus piece by piece. Iran, which had historically controlled Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, watched as Russian forces pushed deeper into territories the Safavids had once governed. The First Russo-Persian War ended in 1813 with the Treaty of Gulistan. Iran lost Georgia and most of the northern Caucasus permanently. It was a humiliation, but worse, it was a warning that nobody in Tehran took seriously enough. The Second Russo-Persian War, from 1826 to 1828, was even more catastrophic. Crown Prince Abbas Mirza led the Iranian army with genuine courage and real military reforms he had been working on for years. It wasn't enough. The Treaty of Turkmenchay in 1828 forced Iran to surrender Azerbaijan and Yerevan, modern-day Armenia, permanently to pay a massive war indemnity and to accept humiliating trade concessions. It remains one of the most painful treaties in Iranian historical memory. But here's the detail that made Turkmenchay particularly stinging. The treaty was partly negotiated with British assistance. Britain, officially Iran's ally against Russia, had its own interests in limiting Iranian power. Iran was learning a brutal lesson about the nature of great game diplomacy. From the south, British pressure was subtler, but equally consequential. Britain's primary concern was protecting its crown jewel, India, and that meant controlling Afghanistan as a buffer state between Russian expansion and British India. Iran, which had historical claims to the city of Herat in western Afghanistan, attempted to reassert control in 1856. Britain immediately declared war, the Anglo-Persian War, and forced Iran to renounce all claims to Afghan territory in the Treaty of Paris. The pattern was becoming clear. From the north, Russia took land. From the south, Britain took influence. Iran was being shaped, its borders defined, its options limited, not by its own choices, but by the strategic calculations of two empires that viewed it primarily as a buffer zone and a market. But here is where the story takes a genuinely remarkable turn, because Iranians, the people, not just the rulers, began to fight back. Not with armies, with something the Qajars hadn't expected: organized public resistance. In 1890, Nasser al-Din Shah, the longest-reigning Qajar monarch, granted a British company a complete monopoly over Iran's entire tobacco industry. Every tobacco farmer, every merchant, every seller in Iran would now operate under British control. The profits would flow to London. The reaction was unlike anything the Qajar court had seen. Grand Ayatollah Mirza Shirazi issued a fatwa, a religious ruling, declaring that smoking tobacco was forbidden as long as the monopoly existed. Overnight, across Iran, people stopped smoking. Completely. Even in the royal harem, the Shah's own wives reportedly stopped smoking in solidarity. Nasser al-Din Shah reportedly walked into his own household and couldn't find a single lit pipe. The monopoly was canceled within a year. Iran had just discovered what collective resistance could do. The tobacco protest wasn't just a victory over one concession. It was a proof of concept. It demonstrated that the clergy, the merchants, and the people could coordinate, that public pressure could override royal decisions, that Iran had a civil society capable of acting. That idea would not be forgotten. Nasser al-Din Shah is one of the most fascinating contradictions in Iranian history. He reigned for nearly 50 years, 1848 to 1896, and he genuinely wanted to modernize Iran. He traveled to Europe 3 times. He was fascinated by photography, technology, and Western institutions. He established Iran's first modern university, the Dar ol-Funun. In 1851, he invited European teachers. He began building telegraph lines. He wanted the tools of modernity without the political reforms that modernity demanded. And that was the paradox. He wanted railways and telegraphs and newspapers, but not constitutions and parliaments and limits on royal power. He wanted a modern Iran that was still an absolute monarchy. History, as it turned out, had opinions about that combination. He was assassinated in 1896, shot by a follower of the revolutionary thinker Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, just one day before he was to celebrate his 50th year on the throne. His successor, Mozaffar al-Din Shah, inherited a country that was ready to boil over. Mozaffar al-Din Shah was weak, ill, and perpetually short of money. His solution, like his predecessors, was to borrow from Russia and Britain in exchange for more concessions. Each loan came with strings. Each string pulled Iran further from sovereignty. By 1905, the pressure had become unbearable. Merchants were being undercut by foreign goods. Intellectuals who had studied in Europe were returning with dangerous ideas about rights and representative government. Clerics were furious about foreign influence over Iranian economic life. For the first time in Iranian history, all three groups were angry at the same time about the same things. The spark came in December 1905, when the governor of Tehran ordered the beating of several sugar merchants who had protested foreign competition. The response was immediate and extraordinary. Thousands of Iranians took sanctuary in mosques and in the grounds of the Shah's own summer palace, refusing to leave until their demands were met. Their central demand was something Iran had never had: a house of justice, a representative body that would limit the Shah's absolute power and give Iranians a say in how they were governed. The word being whispered in tea houses and shouted in protest gatherings was new to Persian political vocabulary. Mozaffar al-Din Shah, exhausted and ill, signed the constitutional decree in August 1906. Iran became a constitutional monarchy. A parliament, the Majlis, was established. For the first time in its history, Iran had a written constitution limiting royal power. It was, by any measure, a revolution. So, what did the 1800s give Iran? It gave Iran its wounds, the permanent border losses to Russia that Iranians still discuss today. It gave Iran its humiliations, the concessions, the debt, the foreign hands shaping its economy. But it also gave Iran something it had never had before. It gave Iran a constitution, a parliament, a civil society that had proven it could organize, resist, and win. The people who had been subjects for 2,500 years had just declared themselves citizens. That change, however fragile, however contested, would define everything that came next. Next episode, the 1900s. Iran enters the 20th century with a constitution, a parliament, and more hope than it has felt in a long time. And within 2 years, that constitution will be suspended by cannon fire. A new Shah will shell his own parliament building. Russia and Britain will sign a secret agreement literally dividing Iran between their spheres of influence, without telling Iran. Then, just when it seems like Iran might finally be able to catch its breath, something extraordinary happens under Iranian soil. Something black, something that the entire world wants, something that will make the great game look like a warm-up act. The discovery of oil in 1908 will turn Iran from a chess piece into the most contested prize on the planet. Episode 5, the 20th century, is where Iran's story becomes the whole world story. 4 episodes, 4 centuries. We've watched a teenage orphan build an empire, a king steal the world's most famous diamond, a people stop smoking overnight to defeat a British monopoly, and a dying Shah sign the first constitution in Iranian history. And we ended last episode with a cliffhanger. Something black was seeping up through the ground in southwest Iran, something that would make the great game look like a practice round. Welcome to episode 5, the 20th century, the century of shocks. In the next 10 minutes, 2 world wars, a CIA coup, a revolution that shook the planet, and an 8-year war that cost a generation, Iran's wildest century. Let's go! We left off in 1906 with Iran's first constitution and a brand new parliament, the Majlis. The mood was electric. Intellectuals were celebrating, merchants were hopeful, clerics who had supported the movement were cautiously optimistic. It lasted about 5 minutes. In 1907, Britain and Russia signed the Anglo-Russian Convention, secretly dividing Iran into spheres of influence: a Russian zone in the north, a British zone in the south, a neutral buffer in the middle. Iran was not consulted. Iran was not informed. Iran found out when everyone else did. Then the new Shah, Muhammad Ali Shah, decided he'd had enough of constitutional limits on his power. In June 1908, he ordered his Russian-commanded Cossack brigade to surround the Majlis building and bombard it with cannon fire. He dissolved parliament and arrested the constitutional leaders. But the constitutionalists fought back. Armed resistance erupted in Tabriz, in Gilan, in Isfahan. 2 years of civil war. And in 1909, the constitutionalists marched on Tehran, deposed Muhammad Ali Shah, and restored the constitution. It had survived. Barely. Again! In May 1908, just weeks before Muhammad Ali Shah shelled his own parliament, something happened in the southwestern region of Khuzestan that would overshadow every political event of the next century. A British company, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which you know today as BP, had been drilling for years on a concession granted by the desperate Qajar government. They'd almost given up. Then the ground opened up. Suddenly, Iran wasn't just a chess piece in the great game. It was the board itself. The British Navy, in the process of converting from coal to oil power, realized Iran was sitting on one of the largest oil reserves on the planet. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, personally pushed for the British government to buy a controlling stake in APOC. They did in 1914. The terms of the original concession were staggeringly lopsided. Iran received a small royalty percentage, while Britain controlled operations, pricing, and profits. The oil beneath Iranian soil was making Britain's empire run, and Iran was seeing a fraction of the returns. World War I tore through Iran, even though Iran declared neutrality. Russian, British, and Ottoman forces all operated on Iranian territory, causing famine, disease, and chaos that killed an estimated 2 million Iranians. The Qajar government was powerless to stop any of it. Into this vacuum stepped a soldier. Reza Khan, a commander in the Iranian Cossack Brigade, staged a coup in 1921, took control of the government, and by 1925 had crowned himself Reza Shah Pahlavi, founding a new dynasty and ending the Qajar era. Reza Shah's project was modernization, fast, forced, and non-negotiable. He looked at Ataturk's Turkey transforming next door and decided Iran needed the same treatment. Railways were built, a national army was created, tribal autonomy was crushed, the legal system was secularized. He banned the veil for women and banned traditional male headwear, replacing both with Western styles by decree. He changed the country's official name from Persia to Iran in 1935. He was building a modern nation-state at speed, whether his population wanted each specific change or not. When World War II arrived and Reza Shah refused to expel German advisors from Iran, Britain and the Soviet Union invaded in 1941, deposed him, and sent him into exile. His son, a 21-year-old named Mohammad Reza, was placed on the throne. The second Pahlavi Shah had arrived. Mohammad Reza Shah spent his early reign as a relatively constitutional monarch, genuinely so. And in this more open political environment, a remarkable figure rose through democratic elections to become prime minister in 1951. His name was Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh looked at the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, still operating on the original lopsided concession, and made a simple, radical argument. The oil beneath Iranian soil belongs to the Iranian people. His policy was nationalization. Take AIOC. Make it Iranian. The Majlis voted for it unanimously. Britain was furious. They imposed a devastating embargo, blockading Iranian oil exports and lobbying the world not to buy Iranian oil. Iran's economy began to buckle, but Mossadegh refused to back down, and his international profile soared. Time magazine named him Person of the Year in 1951. Britain turned to America. They pitched Eisenhower's new CIA with a simple argument: Mossadegh is opening the door to communism. In the Cold War context, that was all it took. Operation Ajax was approved. In August 1953, CIA and MI6 operatives organized street mobs, paid military officers, and ran a propaganda campaign that destabilized Mossadegh's government. On August 19th, the coup succeeded. Mossadegh was arrested in his pajamas, tried for treason, and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. The 1953 coup did not just remove a prime minister, it removed Iran's chance at democratic self-determination at its most promising moment. The wound it created, the deep Iranian suspicion of American and British intentions, did not heal. It is still open today. After the coup, Mohammad Reza Shah ruled with increasing confidence and increasing autocracy. Oil money flowed. The White Revolution of 1963 brought land reform, women's suffrage, and literacy programs. Tehran was modernizing visibly. The Shah was on magazine covers worldwide. In 1971, the Shah threw what might be the most tone-deaf party in modern history: the 2,500-year celebration of the Persian Empire at Persepolis. Heads of state from around the world were flown in. Maxims of Paris catered the event. The cost estimates ran into hundreds of millions of dollars. Outside the palace gates, the Savak, his feared secret police, was imprisoning and torturing political opponents. The gap between the Iran the Shah was projecting to the world and the Iran that millions of Iranians were living in was becoming a chasm. The revolution didn't come from nowhere. It came from everywhere simultaneously. Leftists wanted democracy and social justice. Nationalists hadn't forgotten 1953. The religious establishment, led by Ayatollah Khomeini from exile in Paris, offered a framework that united the grievances under one banner. The protests of 1978 built through the year like a wave. General strikes paralyzed the economy. Millions filled the streets. The Shah, ill with cancer he was hiding from his own government, couldn't decide between crackdown and concession. He tried both, succeeded at neither. On January 16, 1979, Mohammad Reza Shah left Iran. He kissed a handful of Iranian soil at the airport, walked up the stairs of his plane, and never came back. 25 centuries of Iranian monarchy, from Cyrus the Great to the Pahlavis, ended at an airport departure gate. 2 weeks later, Ayatollah Khomeini landed in Tehran. 5 million people lined the streets. He was asked by a journalist on the plane what he felt returning to Iran after 15 years in exile. He said, nothing. Whatever he meant by it, the revolution was complete. The new Islamic Republic was barely established when the next catastrophe arrived. In September 1980, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Iran, calculating that the revolutionary chaos had left Iran militarily vulnerable. It was the opening move of the longest conventional war of the 20th century. What followed was 8 years of industrial-scale warfare that neither side could win, and neither side would end. Trench warfare, chemical weapons used by Iraq against Iranian soldiers and civilians, human wave attacks, cities bombed, oil facilities destroyed, a war that killed somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people. The West largely backed Iraq. The United States provided Saddam with intelligence and looked away from the chemical weapons use. Iran fought with revolutionary fervor, waves of volunteers, and the painful memory that the outside world had chosen sides against them. Again, in 1988, Khomeini accepted a UN ceasefire, describing it as drinking poison. The borders hadn't changed. Nothing had been gained. Everything had been lost. A generation of Iranians had grown up knowing nothing but war, revolution, and isolation. The 1990s brought something Iran desperately needed: a pause. Post-war reconstruction, President Rafsanjani rebuilt infrastructure. President Khatami, elected in 1997 in a landslide, spoke of civil society, dialogue between civilizations, and reform. Young Iranians, the largest youth population in Iranian history, were logging onto the internet, watching satellite TV, and asking questions. The century ended with Iran suspended between two worlds, the revolutionary Islamic Republic it had become, and the globalized, connected, modernizing world pressing against its borders from every direction. The tension between those two identities would define the next century. 5 episodes, 5 centuries, and here we are. Let's take one last look at what we've actually been watching. Empires rose and fell around Iran. The Ottomans? Gone. The Mughals? Gone. The British Empire? Gone. The Soviet Union? Gone. The Safavids? The Qajars? The Pahlavis? All gone. Iran is still here, not unchanged. Iran of 2000 looks nothing like Iran of 1500. The language evolved. The religion shifted. The borders moved. The governments came and went with remarkable frequency and occasional violence. But something persisted. The poetry, the architecture, the sense that this place, this culture, this identity is irreducible, cannot be absorbed, cannot be erased. From a 14-year-old orphan with a red hat and an impossible dream to a nation of 80 million people navigating the most complicated geopolitical position on the planet, this has been Iran. Not a simple story, not a comfortable one, but one of the most extraordinary stories the human species has produced. Thank you for watching 100 Years of Iran, all 5 centuries of it. Iran's story isn't over. It never really is. But that, as they say, is another series.